So very excited to be here today. So as she mentioned, I like to do a lot of impromptu and freestyle poetry. It's something that's been a hobby of mine for around the last 10 years or so. And basically the way that it works is I get a random word, any word that anyone wants to give me, and then based off of that word, I'll create a live impromptu poem that I've never done before off the top of my head. So to get things started, I'm actually going to need a little bit of audience participation. So I need somebody to just yell out a word at me, any word, the first word that comes to mind, and then I'm going to create a poem live here on the spot for you. What was that? The word that he gave me is random. I don't need to do this with anybody. I don't need to do it in tandem. I can do it all alone. Because what happens is, for me, I go into my mental zone and I explore my mental capacity, because my name is and I can keep rhyming so frequently. It's like traveling across the 7 seas. I could do this with ease. And then people bow down onto their knees and they say, "Troy, please give me some more, please." So, I've been doing this now for the last year at different, corporate events, tech parks, all sorts of things like this around India. And the number one most common question that I get after I do this is, how did you do that? Everybody always says to me, it sounds like your mind is racing 1,000,000 miles an hour and you're just able to start pulling words out, and I don't understand how you can do that because I could never do that myself. Now, the response that I have whenever somebody asks me that is that I believe that rhyming or freestyling or any creative endeavor for that matter is all about repetition. I believe that it's a lot like building an anthill. Now, have you ever seen what the inside of an anthill looks like? If you've never seen what the inside of an anthill looks like, when you actually break it down, there's elaborate infrastructure to it. There's interconnected pathways, there's room for storage, and it makes it so that ants are able to navigate it freely. It makes it so that an ant, when it moves in, it can start traversing it faster and faster over time, and also more efficiently bring new, products and food and faster to the soil and surface, all sorts of things like that. Now, whenever you're starting a new creative endeavor, it's always very hard. It's a lot like an ant walking up to a fresh pile of dirt. If an ant is walking up to a brand new pile of dirt, there's obviously no pathways that have already been constructed. It's going to take a very long time for that ant to make it from point A to point B. It's going to be digging and digging and digging, and it's going to have no clear end in sight. It's not going to know exactly where the end of this tunnel might be, but eventually it will get from point A to point B, and now you have a little jagged path. But over time, that path becomes more well-defined. The ant can travel back and forth, and it no longer is a jagged path. It then becomes better, more navigatable with a better infrastructure until that ant is able to move about it freely. Now, similarly, whenever trying a new creative endeavor, the first time that you do it is going to be a lot like digging through the dirt. You're going to feel like it's very hard, you're going to feel like there's no end in sight, and you're not necessarily going to know how to do it. So if I gave you a word like blue, most people would go, shoe, two. Right? So it's very long, it's very hard for you to try and do that. But over time, after you keep practicing, after you keep repeating, it eventually becomes easier to navigate that part of your brain. You start forming connections, and the next thing you know, you can go, oh, blue, shoe, two, me, you. And then you can continue to go. Right? So eventually you start building out the infrastructure of your brain. Now, every time that you try a new one, you're building out new pathways, right? Before I said blue, shoe, two. Eventually I can go you, who, how do you do? I want to wear my new shoe. And for me, now I see in 3D, and I can do all these things. They're as easy as can be, right? So what you're essentially doing is building 2 simultaneous pathways. And then what you can eventually do over time is start connecting those pathways. So if I said, I wear a shoe that's blue, how about you? I've been doing this since I was 2 years old. Now I'm sitting in the cold. People can't do this to me because I'm sitting way too old. Right? So as you continue to do this, you can then eventually build out these pathways and then interconnect them. Now, this becomes really interesting because you're eventually able to explore your own personality and learn more about yourself based on the way that you create. Take myself, for example. I like to do sporadic, impromptu poetry. The first time that I do it, I have to take a word and just jump right in. If you ever told me to sit down with a piece of paper and write out a poem, it's very hard for me. It's a very long, tedious process, and I actually have a lot of mental roadblocks, and it's a lot like digging through the dirt. Now, what I call this is the doers versus planners phenomenon. I, myself, am a doer. You give me a word, I jump right in. I have to keep moving, and I just can start navigating it freely, and I don't really have a clear end in sight, and I don't know where I'm going to take it, but eventually it kind of comes full circle. Now, take for example someone who likes to write poetry and might not necessarily be able to do the sporadic, impromptu nature of poetry in the way that I have. They might sit down and they might take a very long time. But what they gain out of that is they gain substance, they gain depth. They might be able to say, okay, you know what, I want to convey a certain emotion. I want to convey my philosophy. I want to convey an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I want to be able to put that into my poetry. So it might take them a very long time, but at the same time they gain substance and they gain depth. And for me, that's what I lack. My poems might be fast and I might be able to start rhyming something, but I don't necessarily have any substance to it. There's no real message behind it. Now, when you look back at the anthill analogy, I think this becomes really fascinating because what you can essentially see is that for an anthill like mine, you might eventually start seeing elaborate pathways that are all over the place and eventually they start connecting. Whereas you take the other person and their highway and they might have very elaborate pathways, but not as many interconnections. It might make it one or two pathways that are easy to navigate, but if you want to try and move back and forth between all of those, that's when it becomes very difficult. Now, when we learn a lot about our personalities, then we can basically see how do I want to actually approach creative endeavors. If I know that I have a tendency to go after one sort of type of creation, then I might want to try and focus on the other part. That way I build out the new pathways in my brain. If I know that I always want to go after the sporadic, impromptu nature of things, then I might actually want to go towards the other side of things, sit down with a pen and piece of paper, and then eventually be able to create those different pathways that I wanted to create. Now, from there, we also can look at different creative endeavors as different anthills, right? Take, for example, freestyling might be one anthill that I've built. But if I were to pick up a musical instrument, for example, the first time that I try it, it'd be very difficult. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to put the keys and notes together, and it'd be a lot like digging the dirt once again. But over time, as I start building out those pathways, I might then be able to start creating some beats, and then who knows, I might be able to take a piano and then start playing the piano while I continue to rhyme. Or then we could take our life experiences, for example, and our life experiences can be another anthill. And then you can pull from those life experiences and then be able to bring it into the other forms of the anthill. Right? So what eventually you want to be able to do is to build one giant anthill where all of them become interconnected and all of them make it so that you can navigate different parts of your brain freely. Right? So when we talk about creativity, I think one of the things that's most fascinating about this is that we tend to get something that I call tunnel vision. We become so obsessed with one way of approaching a creative endeavor that we actually continue to do it, continue to do it, continue to do it, and then what ends up happening is you can get roadblock. You get tunnel vision. You get so wrapped up in that one technique that you're not actually able to try the other techniques. So say, for example, that you have writer's block and you're not able to do this, what I suggest is that you move out of that anthill and then go try another anthill. And then by the time that you start working on that other anthill, by the time that you go back to the one that you originally had, now you can create a pathway that connects the two of them. And then that is how you're eventually able to create in different capacities and get around roadblock and get around that tunnel vision that we've already seen and all experienced for ourselves. Now, from there, I think it also becomes very interesting because essentially what you're able to do is then take different parts of your life and look at them creatively and examine exactly how I want to be able to do something new. So if I've never tried something before, I can pull from those previous experiences and then continue to build and continue to create. And that's what ends up being the most important for all of us. So now, back to the aspect of repetition is what breeds creativity, right? We eventually do something so many times that it becomes subconscious. There are people who could pick up a guitar and without thinking just start strumming notes, and then eventually, because they're able to strum those notes, then they can think about something else creatively simultaneously, right? The point is that we want to be able to practice something so many times that we're eventually able to do a simultaneous activity consciously while we have another activity going on subconsciously. Right? So take me, for example, as I mentioned before, one of the things that I struggle with is to be able to bring substance and depth and emotion to my rhymes, right? But because now I've been rhyming for so long, what I can eventually do is now I can, because the rhyming aspect is easy, now I can essentially start bringing in depth and focus on the depth while the rhyming comes to me easy. So say, for example, travel, right? I'm going to do this now off the top of my head. So I've been traveling around the world. I've seen a lot of places. I've seen a lot of faces, and I've seen a lot of things. I've seen a lot of the world and I know what joy can bring, and I can see when I've come to India that I'm drinking on some chai, and now people look at me and they say, hey, he's a pretty nice guy. And as I'm sitting in Yogistan, all I can think about is the ways that I can become a Don and all the ways that I can rule the world. Because as I see more people, I see all the little children, all the little girls, and I see all the different problems that they might be facing, and I see all the different opportunities that they might be chasing. And now what I can do is elaborate for all these people and tell you through and through. So everybody, I just want to say thank you for listening to my story. I hope you all enjoyed my Anthill allegory.